Sorry, couldn't put it down. Hi, everybody. I'm Robin Sullivan, and welcome to Friday Night Flock Talk. We are really glad to be here tonight. We've got a fun guest. It's going to be, it's very eye-opening and it's very affirming for me. Let's put it that way. So I have to do the usual reminders. Please follow us on Facebook. That way you'll get notification when we go live. You can follow us on Facebook, follow us on Instagram, and you can subscribe to our YouTube channel. I also want to thank you. Oh, that's true. I'm going to be out in Seattle at the end of the month at Kiko's Toy Chest. We're doing two seminars and a scavenger hunt. We're going to have lunch. It should be a lot of fun. That's on Saturday, April 22nd in Tacoma, Washington. So if you're out that way, please stop by. It's a free event, and we should have a lot of fun. And then on April 23rd, I will be at the Parrot Perch. So lots going on, real busy. And I want to thank you all for, we received a lot of support, support for our sale that we had after our accident. So we want to thank you guys for that support. So without further ado, because you guys didn't sign on tonight to hear me, you signed on to hear my guest. I would love to introduce you all to Danielle Whittaker. Hi, Danielle. How's it going?
Hi, nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. I'm going to read Danielle's bio because it's pretty impressive, and we like you guys to know who you're listening to, if you don't already, because yes, you need to get yourselves one of these. All right. So Danielle Whittaker is the author of The Secret Perfume of Birds, published by Johns Hopkins University Press in 2022. It's been just about a year, which is kind of exciting. Whittaker is an evolutionary biologist who has studied chemical communication in songbirds for over a decade. She currently lives in Oregon with her husband, 2 dogs, 3 cats, and a very noisy Quaker parrot. Are there any other kind? She works at Oregon State University, where she is the managing director of a research center. So I got to tell you, when I opened the book, I don't know if you saw it, Danielle. You probably didn't. When I first came on, I had the book open and I was reading, but the footnote said, "My husband wants to remind you that he got malaria." That's the page that I opened to, and I'm like, "Wait, what?" So it's amazing that actually was aware when we came on. So you got to tell us that story. Your
Of
husband got
course.
malaria.
Yeah, so when I was working on my dissertation for my PhD, I actually didn't study birds yet at that time. I studied primates. And I was in Indonesia collecting samples from gibbons in the tropical rainforest. And my husband had come with me for about 6 months. And I spent about a year in Indonesia, and I never once caught malaria. And he had been there for about a month, and he got malaria, and he's never really uh, been very pleased about that.
Does he travel with you still?
Not for field work, no. He went for that time because I was going to be gone for so long, and he kind of
Okay,
wanted to
sure.
know more about the world I was in, and you know, see what it was like.
So that was kind of that, that question came up because that was the page that I happened to open to. But so I was going to ask you anyway. Life in the field can be humorous. That's part of what I love about your book is that you embrace that humor. And you have a cat. There's one of the cats. We've got
Yeah.
1 out of 3. Awesome.
Say hello to
Oh,
Eliza.
Eliza, a star. Um, but so life can get a bit humorous in the field. Do you have a favorite funny story from the field work that you've done?
Oh my goodness, there's a lot to choose from. Well, let's see. We could start with Indonesia. I, so I worked in this remote rainforest in the Mentawai Islands, which are off the west coast of Sumatra. And I had local people assisting me. And I'm a very different size than most of the people I worked with. I'm tall, I'm 5'9", I'm a large American person, next to these spry, smaller people who had been living in this environment for their whole lives, and they were very comfortable moving in it, and I was very clumsy, kind of gawky, and I had saved my last pair of dry socks, and you had to wear these big rubber boots because it's a ever wet tropical rainforest and you're covered in mosquitoes, and we're crossing this little dinky little bridge that was made out of two sticks basically across a stream, and they went across it just fine, and as I went across it, it broke right in half and I fell straight in the water. And I was fine, I was uninjured, but my socks were wet. I was very upset. It was my last pair of dry socks, but my assistant said it was the funniest thing they had ever seen.
Well, I mean, and honestly, when you're doing field work and stuff like that, wet socks may be worse than malaria. I'm not sure, because really
Yeah.
they're coveted, the dry socks. That's
Oh,
the thing.
definitely.
So, I just how did you decide, that you wanted to study, olfactory sensation with birds?
It was kind of an accident. I originally, as I mentioned already, I was originally studying primate behavior for my PhD, and when I graduated, I decided to switch study species. There's a lot of effort involved in trying to study endangered tropical primates, and the behavior I was interested in was specifically looking at monogamous species and how they choose their mates. And most birds have monogamous social systems, so that seemed like a really great opportunity to use an easier to study animal that I could actually catch here in the United States. And so I joined a lab for my postdoc studying dark-eyed juncos. And I was originally, again, interested in this idea of how birds choose their mates. And there was this hypothesis, there still is this idea that many animal species, including humans, are attracted to members of the opposite sex based on this set of immune genes. It's called the MHC. The technical part doesn't matter right now, but it's just that if you have different immune genes from your mate, then you will each give different genes to your offspring, and they'll be very healthy and be able to detect lots of different diseases. At the time, this hadn't been studied in very many birds, and I wanted to do that. And I was talking about it with a colleague, a professor at the same university, and he looked at me strangely and he said, "Well, that's detected by smell, and birds don't have a sense of smell, so why would you even bother?" And I had never heard that before because I didn't have a bird background. I'd never heard that idea. And I was like, well, that can't be right. That doesn't sound right. And so I started doing research, couldn't find any scientific evidence showing that birds had no sense of smell. So I decided to set out and prove them wrong. And that's been what I've been working on ever since.
Well, and thank you for doing that because I mean, for years I've been fighting that battle. And so, when I first heard about your book and saw the Zoom that you did, it was it was so affirming for me. And I think, it wasn't in a scientific setting, but I was in New Zealand and I was at the Auckland Zoo. I was, doing some consulting and some presenting there. And they were touring us around and we went in with the Kaka parrot and the birds were all out and about and we were walking through and one of them came over and put its nares on my hair and you could hear the inhale and then he turned and started to preen and I was like, wait a minute, this is my aha moment. This is affirming all these times I've said this was happening because people used to tell me all the time with parrots, oh no, they don't have a sense of smell. And if they do, it's just they're tiny. Well, yes, the receptors are significantly smaller than ours and some other animals, but it's still there. So, yeah, when I heard about your work, I was so excited because it was like that. See, I told you guys. I just don't have the doctor to go with it or the science behind it. So, I'm so glad that you did that. Thank you. So, are you currently working on anything that you could share with us, or what are you working on now?
Yeah, so gotten really interested in what actually produces the odors that birds give off and that they use when they're communicating with each other. And some of the work I've done until now has shown that it's actually symbiotic bacteria that live in the uropygial gland that are involved in producing these odors. And so I've gotten really interested in where birds get these bacteria from, how they share them with each other, and how birds like this is also something that happens in mammals. You know, when you have animals living together in a group, they share bacteria and it affects the way they smell and it creates a group specific scent. So I've gotten really interested in trying to understand what level of social interaction is required to actually have an effect on a bird's bacterial community and change their smell.
So, um, all right, just on that point for a minute. So it's a symbiotic bacteria, and the bacteria is based on the environment or the animals living in the environment?
So the bacteria live in the animal's glands, and
Okay,
they
right.
share them with each other through physical contact. Some of them, of course, they do pick up through interaction with their environment. We've actually found that if you take wild birds and you put them in an aviary in captivity, their bacteria changes very quickly. Actually, it gets much less
Huh.
diverse. So yeah, there's an environmental component, there's a social component, and also the birds or the animal's own genetic background will affect that as well because that comes back to that those immune genes I was talking about. Your immune system determines what bacteria your body will allow to live on you. If it thinks it's
Mhm.
a pathogen, it will. Well, they don't think, but if it identifies it as a pathogen, it will destroy it. But if it identifies it as not a problem, then it gets to live. So there's all these different links that affect what kinds of bacteria you carry and what you smell like.
Right. So would in a captive setting, if you people who have companion parrots in their homes, does the amount of, cleaning because you know how much is involved. You have a Quaker parrot. Um, does that affect that as well?
I would assume it does. I don't think anyone has ever measured that. Um,
Mhm.
but yeah, just putting them in a captive environment takes them away from the natural environment that they're normally exposed to. So even the birds that we worked with, we had an outdoor aviary, so they had fresh air coming in through the mesh. We put branches that we had collected from just outside the aviary in there, and they still like it really just went very quickly in just a couple weeks. Their bacterial diversity just kind of plummeted, and so they're just not interacting as much with what they would if they were out in the wild. But I would
Mhm.
think that antibacterial cleaning stuff that many people use would probably have an effect on that as well.
Hmm. So we've got people saying how much they love the way birds smell. They love the way macaws smell. And then I have a regular listener, Lori, who says she's a proud member of Bird Sniffers Anonymous. So it's appealing to us. It's probably very appealing to other birds of the same species. So what you mentioned the juncos. What birds were the primary focus of your work?
I've worked primarily with Juncos, so I started working with them during my postdoc, which I started in 2006, and I actually still work with Juncos in my research. I've done some other studies as well. I did a really fun collaboration in Panama with Dr. Emily Duval looking at lance-tailed manakins, which are amazing little birds. And, yeah, she was really
So
interested in understanding if their odor was involved. They form pairs, so the two males will form a partnership, and they'll do this dance where they leap over each other, and only the alpha male gets the female. And then it's kind of hard to understand why the beta male is participating in this since he doesn't get to mate, but they do. And so she was interested in learning whether the odor might be involved in what makes an alpha male, and so on. So I went down there and we did a project on that.
So did you determine whether the odor is involved in that?
So alpha males and beta males don't smell different, which was interesting finding. So that's not it. But we did find a relationship between age and odor, and females do prefer older males, and older males are more likely to be alpha males. So there's um, it's a not as clear cut. Like you don't see all of the alpha males smelling different than all the beta males, but the age seems to be a factor.
Hmm. You just made a lot of older males who are listening very happy. But so I know Frank just had a birthday. I think Frank, it was just your birthday, wasn't it? And so Frank might fall in that category. I'm not sure. Frank listens all the time. He's a loyal listener. So um, the the little to no sense of smell myth. Um, where do you think that comes from? I mean, I just have never been able to figure it out.
That would be John James Audubon. He set out in 200 years ago to prove that birds didn't have a sense of smell. So this comes from a paper he published about turkey vultures. And even back then, it was widely accepted that they hunted by their sense of smell. But there was also this idea that was pretty prominent among scientists, biologists at the time, that there were trade-offs that had to be made. So, in evolution and biology. So he knew that birds had exceptional eyesight. And he thought, well, if they evolved exceptional eyesight, they would have had to give something up. And of course, smell, nobody cares about smell, right? I don't know why people are so quick to write off smell. But he decided
Mhm.
that they must have lost their sense of smell in order to gain the better vision. And so he did the series of experiments, which were not very well planned out, which he thought proved that they used their eyesight and not their smell to find dead animals. One of them, my favorite one, is he took a pig carcass, a rotting pig, and put it under some bushes and figured, well, they can't see it, so they'll only come eat the pig if they smell it. And they didn't come, and he was like, see, that means they don't have a sense of smell. He also says in the paper, though, that all day the vultures were circling overhead and that dogs were attacking the pig carcass while it was underneath the bushes. So that says to me, yeah, of course they smelled it and they couldn't approach it because dogs. So this set off several decades of a lot of amateur ornithologists. There was a lot of argument back and forth about whether or not this was correct, and people set up their own kind of bad experiments trying to prove or disprove that birds had a sense of smell. And then it kind of lay dormant for a little while until I'd say the 1960s. A couple of women scientists actually started doing research on olfaction in birds. So one was Betsy Bang, who was a scientific illustrator, and she started drawing the internal passages of the bird's nasal passages and finding lots of really interesting structures in there. And then the other person was Bernice Wenzel, who studied behavior and physiology, and she did some excellently designed experiments on a number of different species, showing that yes, of course they have a sense of smell. And what was wrong with a lot of those earlier studies was they were using odors that really had nothing to do with the bird's own biology. So she did some really cool stuff. One of my favorite ones was with the brown kiwi. The brown kiwis, as you probably know, are nocturnal and they forage for insects and worms in the dirt. And so she did some experiments where she had captive kiwis and had like little tubes of dirt that had mesh on top, and so they couldn't see into it. And of course, they're nocturnal, so they don't have a lot of light available to them when they're looking. But they would only pierce the mesh on top of the tube of dirt if it had worms in it, and the only way they could have detected that was through smell. So it
Hmm.
was really important to incorporate relevant odors into the environment to test whether they were detecting them.
Okay. So, that brings up a really good point that determining what's a relevant odor. So when you were doing your studies, how did you decide what was relevant?
Yeah, so for my studies, I was really interested in whether birds were detecting each other's odors. So if they were smelling another bird and getting information about that bird through smell. Birds only have one major gland, the uropygial gland, which is located above the base of the tail. It secretes preen oil, and birds spread this oil over their feathers. And so, unlike us, we have lots of different glands and we sweat and a lot of different odor sources. So I took that oil and I used it in experiments and to test whether birds of the same species or different species could detect that odor and show a reaction to it.
Okay. And so, did you use another species as a control for that, or was it you did? Okay. Um,
So in
yeah,
this particular study, sorry,
go
in
right
this
ahead.
particular study, I had juncos that were nesting, and I was interested in whether or not they would notice if another bird's smell was in their nest. And so I was using juncos, and I gave them one of three treatments. So they either got their own preen oil, so it would just smell like themselves, and they probably wouldn't react, which this was the case. There was no change in behavior. Or I gave them preen oil from a different junco, and actually one they'd never met from a different population. Or it was preen oil from a different species, and I used northern mockingbirds because they're not a threat to them, but they also don't encounter them normally. And what I found was they were very quick to get up and leave the nest if I had put mockingbird preen oil on the nest. They did notice if it was another junco, but it wasn't that significant. And if it was their own preen oil, their behavior didn't change.
Interesting. Because it's kind of that leaving a message, when dogs mark territory or animals, cats. I don't know about you, but my doors have all my doors and doorways have little marks where the cat needs to rub up against them. And it's kind of that I joke around that when the dog goes out, he's getting when he's sniffing around, he's reading the newspaper. He's getting that information. Oh, who was here? What were they doing? What were they up to? Um, and it sounds similar that, they were picking up that kind of information. So that's pretty cool. Um, so, I use, that olfactory sensation, for enrichment and for a lot with foraging. And so the did you find so you said that original study was, with worms and the kiwis that they were, they could smell what they were hunting foraging for, if you will.
Mhm.
So where did you see the most impact? Was it in the social aspect, in the foraging? Where was that for your study?
Yeah, in my study, I didn't look at foraging at all.
Okay.
There are some other people who've looked at the role of olfaction in foraging in songbirds and other birds. For me, I was specifically focused on social interactions. But I can point you to some very cool studies, actually, some really foundational studies of olfactory foraging in birds. A lot of that's been done in seabirds. So this
Mhm.
is something I find fascinating. So birds like albatrosses, they will fly hundreds of miles over open ocean, but they will know exactly where to find fish and squid. And it's because they are smelling the odor given off by a large group of phytoplankton. So where you find large aggregations of phytoplankton, you'll find fish feeding on it. You'll find squid, and you'll also find albatrosses who are there to eat the fish and squid. So they give off this odor called DMSO, dimethyl sulfide, and it
Mhm.
when there's a lot of phytoplankton in one place, especially if it's over like a ridge under the water, it will give this odor up off of the water, and they can detect that from long distances.
I mean, all of this is so fascinating because like you say, we've been told for years and years that this was not the case, and Audubon said, "Well, okay," I mean, we have to we kind of have to take that step back and really see, how does it affect things? And so breeding and flock behavior. Um, did you did you do work on that? Okay.
Yeah, I focused primarily on birds in breeding condition because that's actually when they produce stronger odors. I'd really love to know more about songbirds in winter condition, though, when they are living in those flocks. We don't know much about how they're communicating with odor in the off season.
Mhm. And so, the kind of information you mentioned, that, it was with some of it was about younger, older. Have you been able to decipher what in particular is that information that's being conveyed?
Yeah, we've learned a lot. So different species have they smell different, and they have a species-specific odor. And then within that, of course, you'll see variation. Males and females smell different. Um, Whether or not they're in breeding condition, that will change their odor. We've also found correlations with how aggressive the bird is. We think that's related to testosterone levels. Um, Individual identity can be picked out from odor. So individuals have what we call a repeatable odor. We can measure it several times, and it will be statistically very similar each time. So we assume that means they can identify each other by odor as well.
Hmm. So, okay, so this is probably that scientific moment that I'm just geeking out about, but um, how do you measure um, that that it's repeatable? I mean, what is the unit of measurement? How do you do that?
Good question. So what we do is we take, I guess I should talk a little bit about what we're measuring. So we take preen
Okay.
oil, and it's usually a very tiny, tiny amount, and we use a method called gas chromatography mass spectrometry. A lot of words there, GCMS for short. It's a chemistry method. Basically, what it does is you separate out the molecules in a mixture, and then you can identify what the molecules are. So an odor typically has lots and lots of different chemicals that contribute to the overall blend, and the blend is what we detect. So what we're doing here is we take the odor that comes off of the preen oil, and we separate out the different molecules, and this method separates them on the basis of their size, their molecular weight, which allows us to identify exactly what chemicals they are. In Juncos, I typically work with, it's about 20 compounds that are found in pretty much all Juncos in varying amounts. And then we can measure the concentration in each sample. And so each individual will have like their profile. They have like a lot of compound A and less of compound B and somewhere in between of compound C, for example. And they'll show that same relationship in among those measurements every time you measure them. Whereas
Okay.
a different bird might have a different pattern that you would see.
Mhm. That's interesting. Yeah, so Joanna asked, well, first of all, she said, what are your thoughts or have you looked into Amazons? She said, if we could bottle that smell, she'd be in heaven. And that's not the first time I've heard that, Joanna. In fact, I made a DVD years ago on enrichment, and I have a woman it's Paula Nowak. For those of you who know Paula, stands up in the audience and says, if you could bottle that, you'd make millions. So, but Joanna says, they don't have a oil preening gland, but obviously they have a distinct smell and it's heavier during their season. So have you looked into that at all?
I have not. I don't know that anyone's looked at that specifically. I do know that there are several species that don't have the gland. And so we think, and this is also something I'd really love to know, we think that their odor probably comes more from their skin, maybe
Mhm.
from sloughed off skin cells, and probably bacteria that live on the skin and feed on those cells. So that's probably important there. But I'm just hypothesizing at this point.
No, and that is interesting. So Joanna, you get on that and we're going to expect great things from you and Mark. Um, excuse me. So one of the things, you talked about, Danielle, is that you can get all kinds of information from that bird's odor. Things like health, their reproductive state, you mentioned aggression, um, and that, similar birds. Is there, is there if there's a group like a flock, does one flock have a very distinct odor from another flock? So I guess it's like, if I'm out and I want to go home to my flock, is that identifiable by odor?
I haven't tested that specifically, but I think the answer is yes. So I have compared different populations of the same species, and the populations have statistically different odors. um, I mean, they smell the same to me, which is why I say statistically, but they probably smell different to each other. And then we know that not just from birds, but all animals that we've studied odor in, there's usually a group specific smell. So a great example of this is one of my collaborators actually studied odor in hyenas, and they have this scent pouch. It's called the anal sac, and that's where they have this yellowish paste that they use for scent marking. And it's full of bacteria, and he studied that bacteria. That's actually what gives it the odor. And they will overmark. So, like if one hyena scent marks, another one in the group will scent mark on top of that. And that actually helps them share the bacteria between their glands. And in that way, they develop a group specific odor. And you can compare groups of hyenas that usually have, I don't know, 10 to 20 animals in it, and they will have a
Right.
distinct odor.
It's yeah, I mean, and it's so interesting too, all that information that gets transmitted, whether it's birds, whether it's hyenas or primates, and I mean, when you walk into, like the great ape house at a facility, or that scent, and to us it kind of is like ew, great ape smell, but I'm
Right.
sure it's different if you're a great ape, Um, so, as far as health's concerned, when you were doing your studies, um, was that odor in any way indicative of poor health? Or, I mean, I'm just thinking, applications in the field of, with companion parrots. Is that something that could possibly be an indicator for people?
I'm sure it could. We know from studies of humans that when a person is sick, their odor changes very quickly, and other people can detect that change as well.
Mhm.
Um, I haven't looked at sickness in birds. Usually, if we do have a bird we're working with that's sick, they're pretty much exempt from the study, So
Right.
I haven't actually sampled sick birds, but I think there are studies in chickens. So this is pretty big in the poultry industry, and
Hmm.
believe there is some data to support that in birds as well.
Interesting. So, as far from your perspective, um, what's the one thing that was the what was the biggest takeaway from for you, besides the fact that they do indeed have olfactory sensation? Because that's just a woohoo win right out of the gate. But what's the your biggest takeaway from this work that you've done?
Honestly, I learned so much about olfaction in general that I didn't know. I mean, I realized how much. What are you doing up there? Sorry. I realized how
Medicines?
important it was. That's Kirk. I realized how important it was in my own life. For some reason, like I said before, we were quick to discount odor as not being that important to us. We notice odors that smell bad. We notice things that smell exceptionally good, but we don't pay attention to kind of those everyday smells and what that's telling us. And I'm so much more aware of that now, and the role it plays in our lives and the lives of all animals, that I kind of just think about it all the time. Anytime there's a behavioral question, part of my brain is like, what about the smell? How is that playing a role here? It's everywhere. It's so important.
And that's really interesting, from a behavior standpoint. We all whenever if I'm doing a behavior consult, oh look, Nick found great pictures. I love Nick. We got that kiwi down in the bottom.
He's
And
great.
but when you're looking at behavior, I ask, has anything changed in the house? Has are there new people in the house? Is there another animal, a new bird, a change of, schedule? But I never ask about olfactory stuff. And it just makes sense that it could affect, um, and especially where a lot of the birds that, well, all of the birds that we have at home, but a lot of the birds that I'm sure you've worked with are prey species. So that scent piece, a change in scent, they say, there's something in the wind. Well, that's a big deal if you're a prey animal. Um,
Yeah.
that's really, I never, that's interesting. We'll have to kind of add that into our behavior toolbox because it's something that I don't think we consider. And you're right, we do the whole, ew, that smells bad, or ooh, chocolate chip cookies. But, they say when you want to sell your house to bake chocolate chip cookies before you have
Mhm.
your open house. Um, and it's linked with behavior in humans. Why wouldn't it be linked with behavior in other animals? That's pretty
Yeah.
interesting. I love when I learn stuff on this live stream. It's and I appreciate, you making me think like that. Um, so you talk about them being, it has to be something that's, relevant to their ecology, if you're going to do this kind of work. And, they may ignore smells that have no meaning to them. So, what I guess the best way, I mean, you've done it using the oils from the preening glands. What would you suggest for people who are listening? Because I'm a big proponent of olfactory enrichment with companion parrots. Um, how could they go about in a home science way identifying what some of those smells might be that would be intriguing for their pet birds?
Yeah, I would start with um, smells that they would find in their wild environment, so probably plants, and you would
Mhm.
want to choose those plants carefully and make sure they weren't harmful to the bird or whatever. And of course, food. I mean, all all animals are pretty food motivated, I think. But yeah, I would start there. Definitely plants.
Yeah, 'cause I mean, I've done work with some folks, and I know, there's a gentleman who's got, visually impaired hyacinth-macaw, and we worked on well, he and I talked, and then he worked on, doing scent trails, throughout the aviary to kind of lead this bird, like, from one point to another, and he used, I believe he used rosemary, and a lot of herbs, people use a lot of herbs with their parrots, and a lot goes into when you say food motivated, it goes into the chop or whatever that they're feeding, the raw food. And I think that would, be a good place for people to start, might be some of
Mhm.
the herbs that they're using, or like you said, the plants. If you've got, browse or live, branches that you're cutting and putting in an aviary, those kind of scents might be ways to kind of use that with a companion parrot. So, have you done any work with your Quaker?
My Quaker won't let me get near him. He started out as my bird, but he flipped. He's my husband's bird now, and
That happens all the time.
yeah.
It definitely does. Um, but I think again, getting so the sense that you studied when you were working with these different populations of birds. Um, it would make sense to me, and correct me if I'm wrong. I think that you know they're bringing, you would go, this bird smells one scent, or there's this odor, so they would go to another bird because they have an odor that is either recognizable or that is intriguing to them. Um, and I think, in that way, this is similar to getting parrots to do some things that we want them to do. I mean, do you think there's a correlation there?
Yeah, I think there could be. One thing that was a surprising result in a couple of different studies, including one of my own. In both studies, we were both trying to test whether they were interested in same-sex smell or different sex smell, and we were expecting they would go towards the opposite sex if it was involved um, in mate choice. And we had both had some strange results. And turns out that this is a better example is not my own study. It's a study on house finches. they reanalyzed the data and they found out the males they weren't really interested in the female smell. What they were doing is they were choosing based on the condition of the other male they were smelling. So they would only go to the female if they were avoiding the male. So if he was a bigger, stronger male than the one who was doing the choosing, he would avoid him and go towards the female. So it wasn't choosing a smell, it was avoidance. So I think that was interesting to me too. Like, okay, they use it as like, oh, that's a bad thing. I don't want to go there. More than,
Mhm.
oh, that's a good thing. I do want to go there, at least in these particular studies. So you
Right.
need to think of both things. Like, what do you want them to stay away from, for example? Like maybe you don't want them on, a piece of furniture, or
Mhm.
or what do you want them to go towards? And so both types of odor are really important in the bird's behavior.
Mhm. And yeah, I think that, that goes along with that behavior modification piece. If we're gonna try to change an animal's behavior, we would normally veer away from that, from an aversive, if you will.
Yeah.
But I think you bring up a really good point that there are attractants and there are repellents when it comes to odors. Joanna says, would this be why maybe birds don't like certain people but like another person?
It could be. Yeah, that's a great question, and I think that's probably why people like certain people and not others, so would not surprise me.
Yeah, and I think that's it's and it comes right down to, again, until they create that universal translator, that, from Star Trek, we're never gonna really know what they're thinking, or why not. So Joanna says they might not like your smell. It's true, Joanna. It's your smell that they might not like, not other people. But, so, um, so taking what you've learned, where do you go from here? You talked about, you taking it a step further, but where do you go from here with this, Danielle?
That's a good question. I'm actually not sure right now. Yeah, there's still so many questions out there. I'm not in a traditional, like, faculty kind of position, and so my research isn't currently supported. So mostly
Uh-huh.
right now, I'm hoping to inspire other academics who do have the resources to pick up on some of these loose threads. So, in addition to the book, I've written a few articles and I'm doing some presentations, kind of like the state of the field and what kinds of things should we be looking at next. So for the last 15, 20 years, there's been, if you were to like look on Google Scholar, for example, and like see how many papers on bird olfaction came out, they've been increasing every year, but a
Mhm.
lot of them have been really focused on like answering the question, can birds smell this? Do males and females smell different? So really basic descriptive stuff. And I feel like, okay, we've got that now. Like, yes, every single species we've looked at, yes, they have a sense of smell. Yes, they produce odors and it gives information. So I feel like there are so many more questions. We can look at so many more interesting things. And every time I do an event like this one, I get questions from the audience like, have you looked at this? Have you looked at that? I'm like, no, but I'm going to write that down because you all have wonderful ideas. And yeah, there's just
Well,
these really complex questions that will take some work, but I think they're worth pursuing.
yeah, and I think it's so important, and again, I wanna thank you for doing that work, because I can tell you, so I was a total helicopter mom. My son is now married and on his own, but, back in the day when he was doing science fair projects, we, we do you like that, we? He did a project that was about olfaction in corvids, and we had fox urine, we had, in different scents, and to see how the corvids would respond, and was it stronger in a corvid versus, we had a red tail that he was working with, and was the raven more apt to be aware of the scent than the hawk, and then we had he had a hamster that was in part of that. So it was like, is it, which animal has the better sense of smell and that kind of stuff. And it was mom pushing because I wanted to know about olfaction in birds. But I mean, it's been out there and you're right. The question has hung there and it's that question has been answered. We've got the answer.
Mhm.
Yes. So now we need to take, how do we use that? How do we, because there's so much we had last week. I had, uh, uh, Dr. Brightsmith, Dr. Don Brightsmith, and Gabby, um, and we were talking about scarlet macaws, and how they're really trying to get um, their science to help people with companion parrots. And I think, we would love, Danielle, if you ever decide you want to take up this study, we would, as a community, I'm speaking for the whole community, love to see information on the olfaction in parrots and, citizens,
Yeah.
because it's, to me, it's just another piece in your toolbox. It's another tool in your
Mhm.
toolbox to enrich their lives while they're in captivity. So I think, that would be amazing. So everybody needs to buy your book so that we can fund your research. That's how this has to work. If you guys use that QR code there, you can get to the Amazon link for Danielle's book. So we want this to happen. Um, and I know we have some listeners who have read your book, and I'm gonna call him out on it. How can Mark get his book signed? So that's Joanna. Joanna's asking for her husband, 'cause, is he not able to type, Joanna? The they already have your book, Danielle. How can they get it signed?
I'd be happy to sign it. I guess we could have you ship it to me at Oregon State University, and I could sign it and ship it back. That might be possible.
All right, we can do that. Afterwards, I will get the information from Joanna and Mark, and from you, Danielle, and I'll put you guys together um, so that we can make that happen. Because Mark is a big fan. I remember when
Well,
I
thank you.
listened, I when I attended the Zoom that you were doing, I told him I was doing that, and he was like, "Oh, that was great! I read that book; it was really so good, and you got to have her on." And here you are. So yeah. I'm kind of excited for this. So olfactory opportunities. So from your studies, we're finding out that, it's about identification, it's about, breeding, there's some health involved. Um, Thoughts on how we could possibly use this with citizens? How can we enhance their captive experience using olfaction?
Yeah, I would say it's important to pay attention to their responses to things, and remember that what they're responding to might be something you can't see, right? So if thinking about plants, for example, if you're cutting branches to put in the cage, not all branches are equal, right? They're not. Some of them are going to smell different. They're going to have different all kinds of different things, but smell could be a reason they like or dislike it. So, yeah, paying attention to what they're reacting to, keeping that in mind as a thing they might be reacting to. And also, like you mentioned, I think we could use smell to detect if our pets are not well. So pay
Mhm.
attention to your bird's smell, and I'm sure most of you already do. I think every time I talk to parrot people, they always talk about how good their birds smell. So that's great. It means your birds are healthy, right? But yeah, it's just paying more attention to that olfactory environment and keeping it in mind when you're changing things or trying to figure out what's wrong if the bird's unhappy about something, you know?
That's yeah, I mean, I'm really excited about that dynamic. I think that's kinda cool, and I wanna look into that some more. Um, as far as, Nick wants to know, have you ever smelled an eclectus? I don't know if he's asking the group. Uh, I have not, Nick. I have never smelled an eclectus, strangely
Me
enough,
neither.
but Danielle hasn't either, so you'll have to fill us in on that. Good, bad, indifferent? I don't know. But, I think too, part of it is, he said it's a smell you won't forget. Okay, so now Nick has intrigued everybody that's got an eclectus is gonna go running into their bird room and start sniffing their eclectus. it's gonna be it might be a bad situation, Nick. I don't know what you've started here. But excuse me. Is there a way, Danielle, to assess or to study what it is, um, what they're processing as far as scent is so you talked about you measured, took the preening oil and then you measured out the molecules. Because that was one of the arguments that I always got when I would talk about doing olfactory enrichment was, well, parrots can't process as much. They're not processing, what we're processing. Is there a way to study that?
So there are some studies looking at the genes of olfactory receptors in birds. So um, as you know, olfaction is nothing like sight, right? So sight is very simple. We understand how it works. You've got the rods and the cones, and you see the light. Olfactory receptors, though, we have hundreds of different ones in our nasal lining, and they attach preferentially to different molecules. And then there's this very complex set of neural interactions that goes back to your brain, and then your brain has to figure out what you're smelling. So no, they don't have the same olfactory receptors as we do, but they do have plenty of them. And in fact, there's been
Mhm,
some recent work finding that there's this whole gene family of olfactory receptors that is greatly expanded in birds. So they're similar to ours, but not quite related to ours. So we don't actually know, like we can never know what another species is actually smelling. We don't know
mhm,
what their smellscape is, right? Like in fact, we don't even know what another person is smelling because we have so much
mhm,
variation within species on what genes we're carrying and what we can detect and what we don't. Um, so I think that might be one of the reasons that that was out there, was that they had limited ability to study olfactory receptors, and the genes that they had for mammals, they weren't finding in birds. And that's because way back in evolutionary time, they went off in a different evolutionary trajectory. So now that we've
mhm.
figured out how to sequence those genes, we know that they genetically they appear to have the same kinds of ability that mammals do.
Interesting. Yeah, and I think that's one of those situations where from a citizen science point of view, it's a matter of let's try this. Let's see what their reaction is. Is there a reaction?
Yeah.
If it's negative, you don't want to do it again. If it's just ignore, okay. If it's a positive, then you can work with that particular scent, whatever it may be. And you guys who are listening, just as always, always tell you guys safety comes first. Just make sure that whatever we're not talking big scents, we're not talking, air fresheners or any of that kind of stuff, or big scented candles that because we all know those are a no-no with our birds. But using chilies, using spices, things like that, any spice that you're already adding to food or that you looked up and you've researched and that it's safe, those kind of things. And offering, you know, not just a scent trail. You can do a scent trail. You can offer it in, no essential oils, please, Karen says. Definitely, that's a no-no. So, but things that, maybe you put a scent on a piece of wood and you put it underneath underneath something and see if they'll go find it, see if they seek it out or they forage for it. It's just another way, in my opinion, to get them moving, and to get
Yeah.
them, utilizing the space that they have. Um, so, all right, other than the Amazon, because we've got a bunch of people that you're going to be signing your life here. A bunch of people who are interested in your book. Any other way to purchase besides Amazon, or is that the best way for people to do it?
You can also buy directly from the publisher. So Johns Hopkins University Press, I think it's just jhup.com, or you can Google
Mhm.
that, and they have a purchase page for my book and other books that they publish. You can also buy it from other online sellers like bookshop.org. You can request it at your local library. I always encourage that too, or your local bookstore. So, but yeah, it's
All right.
easily obtainable.
Okay. because we want everybody getting this information and sharing it. The can you tell I need my glasses and I don't have them on? The Johns Hopkins is www.press press .jhu.edu. Laurie says you can read it on Kindle too. There we go.
That's right.
So
There's
lots of
also
different
an
ways.
audiobook version. So
Great. There we
there's
go.
an audiobook version. So like I'm an Audible subscriber, and it's available there as well.
Yeah, I have an Audible subscription, and I know Carrie Ellen was on before. Carrie Ellen is she drives everywhere, so she can listen to it while she's driving on
Great.
Audible. So oh, there we go. Look at this is my tech genius. It's wonderful. Thank you. Um, so Danielle, any last words on the secret perfume of birds?
I'm just so happy that like people are thinking about this now and are interested and are looking for ways to apply it to their own birds. Every time I give a talk, there are always parrot people in the audience, and I always get questions about parrots. So I was really excited to have the opportunity to talk to parrot people. And was excited to hear that you have cared about this topic for a long time and you're helping people realize its importance.
Well, thank you. All right. Well, you guys, thank you all for tuning in, and thank you, Danielle, for joining us. Next week, I don't think we're going to have a live stream, but on the 14th of April, I will be joined by a young aviculturist who I met at an event in Florida. I was so intrigued by this young lady. I asked her a couple questions, and her answers were remarkable for a person her age. So hopefully, I'll see you guys in a couple weeks. Just keep checking the leather elves, and you'll find out if we're going to be on next week. I don't think we will, but we will be back the following week. So thank you, Danielle, and please keep us in the loop with any new exciting studies you do, and hopefully everybody's going to run out and get the secret perfume of birds. And I know it's going to be rainy here. You're in the Pacific Northwest, so it'll be rainy there. I can almost guarantee it.
Yeah.
Um, but all right, so you take care, and we will see you all in a couple of weeks. Bye bye.